Communication is the process people use to exchange information. There are two types of communication, verbal and nonverbal. Verbal communication is the words people use. The words represent the objects and concepts being discussed. Content is the literal words being used, while context is the environment in which communication occurs. It can include time, physical, social, emotional, and cultural environments. Situation or circumstances can clarify the meaning of the content. Nonverbal communication is the behavior that accompanies the verbal content. Body language, eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, rate of speech, hesitations, grunts, groans, etc. It can indicate the speaker's thoughts, feelings, needs, and values that they mostly act out unconsciously. Process denotes all nonverbal messages the speaker uses to give meaning and context to the message. It requires the listener to observe the behaviors and sounds and to interpret the speaker's nonverbal behaviors to see if they agree or disagree with the verbal content. Congruent is when the content and process agree. Incongruent is when the content and process disagree. Nonverbal communication gives a more accurate message than the verbal. Therapeutic communication is an interpersonal interaction between the nurse and patient during which the nurse focuses on the patient's specific needs to promote an effective exchange of information. Therapeutic communication techniques help the nurse to understand and empathize with the patient's experience. All nurses need therapeutic communication skills to help their patient. It can help the nurse accomplish goals like establishing a therapeutic relationship, identifying the most important patient concern or goal, assess the patient's perception of the problem, facilitate the patient's expression of emotion, teach self-care skills, recognize the patient's needs, implement interventions, and develop a plan of action with the patient. Therapeutic communication includes 5 types of touch. Functional professional touch is used in examinations and procedures. Social polite touch is used in greeting, like a handshake or an air kiss. Friendship and warmth touch would be a hug and greeting, an arm around the shoulders, or slapping someone on the back. Love intimacy touch includes tight hugs and kisses between lovers or close relatives, and sexual arousal touch is used by lovers. Touching can be comforting and supportive when it is welcomed and permitted, but it can also be an invasion of personal space. Some patients with mental illness have a hard time understanding boundaries and knowing when it isn't okay to touch someone else. Patients may have been touched inappropriately or hurt in the past and may not be comfortable saying something about it, so most psychiatric units have a policy against touch. Staff should always tell a patient when they are going to touch before they touch. The nurse should use words that are as clear as possible when speaking to a patient. If your patient is anxious, which people frequently are in the hospital regardless of the setting, they lose cognitive processing skills. The more anxious they are, the less they are able to process. Concrete messages are important for accurate information exchange. The words need to be explicit, and the questions should be clear, direct, and easy to understand. Abstract messages are unclear words that require the listener to interpret what is being said. They may use figures of speech or unclear terms. Therapeutic techniques can help to facilitate the interaction. Exploring, focusing, restating, and reflecting encourage the patient to discuss their feelings or concerns in greater depth. Other techniques may be useful in focusing or clarifying what is being said. The nurse can give feedback to the patient by making an observation or presenting reality. Non-therapeutic techniques do not facilitate communication and should be avoided. Closed-ended questions that can be answered with a one-word response do not encourage the patient to express what is happening, and why questions may be seen as criticism or a negative judgment from the nurse. Some examples of non-therapeutic techniques are advising, belittling, challenging, probing, and reassuring. Please see Table 6.2 in your book for more non-therapeutic techniques. To understand what a patient means, the nurse watches for signals and cues. Cues are verbal or nonverbal messages that signal key words or issues for the patient. Overt cues are clear and direct, while covert are vague or indirect that may need to be explored further. Nonverbal communication is the behavior the person exhibits while delivering the verbal content. It includes facial expression, eye contact, space, time, boundaries, and body movements. About 1/3 of the person's meeting is verbal, and 2/3 is nonverbal, so nonverbal communication is important to pay attention to. Some ways that nonverbal messages can go with the verbal. Accent is using flashing eyes or hand movements. Compliment, giving quizzical looks or nodding. Contradict, rolling the eyes. Regulate, taking a deep breath or using phrases like and Repeat, nonverbal behavior that augments the verbal, like shrugging your shoulders when saying, "Who knows?" Facial movements connect with words to indicate meaning. They can be expressive, impassive, or confusing. Expressive portrays the person's moment-to-moment thoughts, feelings, and needs. They may be evident even if the person doesn't want them to be. Impassive is frozen into an emotionless expression that may be similar to a mask. Confusing is the opposite of what the speaker wants to convey. They might be smiling when they're talking about something sad. Body language is another form of nonverbal communication. A closed body position, where you have crossed legs and folded arms, might indicate the person may feel threatened or defensive or is not accepting. An open body position has the legs uncrossed, with the feet on the floor or crossed only at the ankle, arms at the side or hands in the lap. This signals interest and acceptance of what the person is saying. Hand gestures can add meaning to strengthen the impact of the words used. Positioning is also important. Sitting beside or across from the patient can help put the person at ease, whereas if you're behind a desk, that can create a barrier. Vocal cues are nonverbal sound signals that are transmitted along with the content: volume, tone, pitch, intensity, speed, and so forth. If the person using extraneous words with long descriptions, it's circumstantiality and might indicate that they're confused about what happened, or they may be a poor historian. Slow, hesitant responses may mean the person is depressed or experiencing psychomotor retardation. High-pitched, fast speech may mean that they are anxious. Eye contact is looking into the other person's eyes during a conversation. Does the person maintain culturally appropriate eye contact? Are they unable to maintain eye contact? Or is the eye contact too intense? Silence can indicate a variety of things. Are they considering what to say? Are they depressed and they don't have the energy to maintain a conversation? Are they even paying attention to the conversation? Silence can be a good therapeutic technique. Many people don't like silence, so they may give you more information in order to fill it. Maintaining boundaries is an important part of helping people feel comfortable during a conversation. Some cultures may have different boundaries than what we find here. Hispanics, Asians, East Indians, and Middle Eastern cultures may prefer to be a little closer than what is typically comfortable for us in the United States. Space and distance zones are important. The intimate zone is about 0 to 18 inches between people. This can feel threatening and cause anxiety. The personal zone is 18 to 36 inches between people. It's usually comfortable for family and friends who are sitting around talking. The social zone is 4 to 12 feet. It's good for communication at school, work, and business meetings. The public zone is 12 to 25 feet. It's used with a speaker and an audience, small groups. Therapeutic communication is usually most comfortable when the nurse and patient are about 3 to 6 feet apart. Active listening is refraining from other mental activities and concentrating exclusively on what the patient says. Active observation is watching the speaker's nonverbal actions as they communicate. Active listening and observation help the nurse to recognize the issue that's most important to the patient, know what further questions to ask, use additional therapeutic techniques to guide the conversation, understand the patient's perceptions of the issue rather than jumping to conclusions, and to interpret and respond to the message objectively. Hildegard Peplau used observation as the first step in the therapeutic interaction. Messages often have more meaning than just what is spoken. The nurse needs to discover all the meaning in a patient's communication. A patient might say, "I'm so tired, I can't go on." This could mean that the patient is tired and needs to sleep before they're able to go about their day, or it could mean that the patient is depressed and doesn't want to live anymore. Understanding context is also important. Something people like to say a lot is, "I'm going to kill you." This could be said in anger, with the person actually meaning that they want to kill the other person, or it could be said in jest when someone does something we didn't want them to, like surprise them with a party or volunteer them to speak in front of the class. Context can tell you who was there, what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and why the patient believes that it happened the way it did. Spirituality is a patient's belief about life, health, illness, death, and their relationship to the universe. Spirituality is not religion, which is an organized system of belief. Spirituality and religion offer comfort and hope and can greatly affect a person's health and healthcare practices. The nurse needs to assess their own spiritual and religious beliefs as they can be very subjective and vary from person to person. The nurse needs to remain objective and non-judgmental and not allow the patient's beliefs to affect their nursing care. Culture is all the socially learned behaviors, values, beliefs, and customs that are transmitted down to each generation. Different cultures and different customs regarding communication, both verbal and nonverbal. In most Western cultures, a handshake is used when greeting someone, but in some Asian cultures, bowing is used to greet someone. The nurse can ask the patient if any cultural practices will affect their care while in the hospital. If they don't speak English or don't speak it well, a translator will be needed to communicate with the patient. The US and many European cultures are individualistic, and the patient will speak for themselves and make their own decisions. Other cultures are more paternal, and the eldest male will speak for the patient and make decisions for them. Therapeutic communication techniques and skills can be used to accomplish goals such as establishing rapport, actively listening, identifying the issue of concern, being empathetic and genuine, understanding the patient's perception, exploring the patient's thoughts and feelings, developing problem-solving skills, and promoting the patient's evaluation of solutions. A therapeutic communication session can happen a few different ways. Sometimes the therapeutic communication can be a planned session. Sometimes it's the patient coming to the nurse and asking to talk. And sometimes the nurse may see something on the unit that needs to be addressed, like a patient in a corner crying or looking upset. When first meeting the patient, introductions should take place, and a contract for the relationship should be established. This doesn't mean a formal written contract, but just an establishment of roles, such as, "My name is Mindy and I'm going to be your nurse today." That establishes that you are the nurse and you'll be with them for the day. Some small talk is appropriate to get to know the patient, then use a broad opening question to identify the major concern. In the non-directive role, it's the patient and not the nurse who identifies the problem they want to discuss, while the nurse uses active listening to identify the topic of concern. The patient identifies the goal while the nurse gathers information, focusing on the patient and acting as a guide for the conversation. Broad openings and open-ended questions help in gathering information. The patient does most of the talking. In a directive role, a patient is usually in a crisis or is out of touch with reality. Yes/no questions and problem solving will help the patient to deal with the issue at hand. How questions are phrased is also important. Open-ended questions are more likely to get the patient to talk than a closed-ended question that they can answer yes or no to. Different types of questions are asked based on what kind of information we want to get. Active listening will help decide which questions to ask based on the cues from the patient. In English, we frequently use the word feel for the word think. How many times have you walked out of a test and asked each other, "How did you feel about the test?" You might get a variety of answers from the touchy-feely to the cognitive assessment of the test. But if you ask, "What did you think of the test?" the answers are more likely to be cognitive. So be aware of what you're asking. Use think when you want a cognitive answer, and feel if you are trying to explore feelings on an issue. Sometimes the patient may not be clear in what they're saying. Don't assume that you know or understand. Ask clarifying questions if there's doubt, and to confirm understanding. Clarifying questions may also need to be asked to clarify information. Patients will sometimes talk about something that doesn't really matter to them in order to avoid difficult topics. Unimportant topics are much less threatening to them and don't cause the anxiety they feel with the important ones. Watching the patient carefully will let the nurse know what's going on. Some things that can be done if the patient seems to be avoiding a difficult topic. Ask the patient which issue is more important. You can go with the new topic that needs to be discussed. Reflect the patient's behavior to signal to them that there's a more important topic to talk about. Mentally file the other topic away to explore later, and ignore the new topic because the patient's trying to avoid the original topic. Many therapeutic situations involve problem solving. The nurse is not supposed to be the expert or tell the patient what to do. Instead, the nurse should help the patient explore the possibilities and find a solution to their problems. Frequently, talking through the problem and exploring their own perceptions will help the patient see the possible solutions. Telling the patient how to solve their problems doesn't allow them to be a participant in the process, develop problem-solving skills, or to grow and change. When the patient is involved in the problem-solving process, they're more likely to follow through on the solution, develop new coping skills, maintain or improve their self-esteem, and to believe that they are capable of change. The problem-solving process has several steps. First, identify the problem, then brainstorm all the possible solutions. Finally, select the best alternative, then implement the selective alternative, and evaluate the situation. If they're not happy with the results, then choose another alternative and continue the process. Assertive communication is the ability to express positive and negative ideas and feelings in an open, honest, and direct way. It recognizes the rights of both parties and is useful in many situations like solving problems, resolving conflict, or expressing feelings and thoughts that might be difficult. It can help a person deal with issues with coworkers, family, friends, or your fellow students. Assertive communication works best when the speaker is calm, makes specific factual statements, and focuses on I statements. This type of communication doesn't guarantee anything will change, but it does allow the person to express themselves in an open, honest way, and it might lead to a discussion on how to resolve the problem. Possible responses to a problem are aggressive, passive-aggressive, passive, and assertive. As care for patients expands more and more into the community, the role of the nurse also expands. The nurse may be the major caregiver and resource for increasingly high-risk patients and their families. They may be responsible for primary prevention in health and wellness. Therapeutic techniques are essential when caring for patients in the community. When caring for older adults in the community, it's important to assess the family relationship and to be responsive to the needs of the patient and families. The nurse also needs self-awareness and knowledge about cultural differences. The nurse is the outsider when entering someone's home and needs to be sensitive to their beliefs, behaviors, and feelings. The nurse can always ask the family to teach them about their cultural practices and learn from them. The nurse is a member of the healthcare team for each patient and needs to collaborate with the patient, their family, and other healthcare providers in order to ensure quality care for each patient. Therapeutic communication influences the effectiveness of many interventions, so the nurse needs to evaluate and improve their communication skills on an ongoing basis. Gaining awareness of how you communicate is the first step to improving communication skills. You can ask colleagues for feedback and examine your own communication skills. When working with patients from different cultures, the nurse needs to know or find out what communication styles are comfortable for them in regard to touch, eye contact, proximity, etc., and adjust your own style to help the patient be comfortable.